For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 2, Episode 59 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our discussion on advancing the global health agenda for NAFLD starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Jeff, this article was timely, very apropos, and important. To your point about disease awareness, that's a huge issue. A huge issue for patients, providers, public policymakers, payers. It's important for all of us.
We've done some work on preparedness and found essentially of 120 countries, none scored over 50. So in the American standards, none would have passed for being prepared.
I think this was one of these heads-up moments. I'm seeing patients discussing standard of care, test results, but all of a sudden here we are looking from a helicopter view at healthcare systems and discussing not a single patient, but the entire community, and realizing that there are so many steps that are crucial to develop and implement care.
For every person that we take off the pathway with early notification of liver fat, that's potentially a diabetes case avoided. The cost saving potentially of this sort of consensus and implementation throughout the world, particularly in low and socioeconomic countries, I just can't fathom those numbers.
One way or another, the liver is going to get a lot of people, and it's going to get a lot of people by surprise. And with the numbers we have projected to 2030, it's going to be a major public health problem, not just because we said it is in 2021, it simply will be.
We need to deliver a message that is impactful, and that at the same time, then we have a message to our governmental agencies that say we have to create spaces and places for people to go and do those things. But quite frankly, that's going to be at the groundswell level as well.
One way to think of this is boxing. The left jab is the non-communicable disease and what it does to the overall metabolic system, diabetes, heart, etc. And then the uppercut is actually liver cancer. So if the jab hasn't taken you out, the liver cancer would cause a demon of a problem for you.
Just before publication, the chief editor of Nature Reviews Gastroenterology said, could other nature journals endorse this? And suddenly, the other nature journals dealing with our comorbidities said, hey, fatty liver disease is important to us. We're going to endorse this statement. And Nature itself came and endorsed. It became like just sort of this family came together. It was really a neat process.
A global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader, Dr. Stephen Harrison, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guests, health systems and hepatology key opinion leader Professor Jeffrey Lazarus and hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Professor Jörn Schattenberg as they discuss the recent consensus statement, Advancing the Global Public Health Agenda for NAFLD, this week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Welcome to the third weekly episode of Surfing NASH with live audience. I hope everyone's sound works this week. This episode, I believe, recognizes a profoundly important moment in the public history of NAFLD, the publication of the consensus statement. So I hope you can hear each of us and all of us, and we sound clear and not fuzzy, not a lot of buzzing in and out. And I'd love to get Mike Wilson at least 2 hours of sleep the night he works on this. So with that, I just want to get going because we've got a lot to cover. We have with us Jeff Lazarus, who's been with us before. Hey, Jeff, how are you this evening?
Fine. Thanks for having me again, Roger.
Thanks for coming back. And then we have Jörn Schattenberg, rapidly becoming, as I've described him, the fifth Beatle, who was also part of the consensus process. Hey, Jörn, if you can see, you'll see that Jörn's camera is blipping in and out during the conversation. We're hoping his voice will be present throughout. Jörn, can you hear me right now?
I do hear you well.
Good. Of course, Louise and Stephen. Louise, how are you this evening?
Very well, thank you.
Stephen?
Yeah, doing well. Coming to you from Texas, where it's December, but it's still 70 degrees. We'll take it.
Or for those of you who live on the other continent, what's that, 21, 22? Still pretty good. I'm in Pennsylvania, although my office, but where I always am. So with that, I would just like to kick off really quickly and simply our basic groundbreaking question. First of all, if you're in the audience, rules are the same. You got a document from us at one point that told you how to ask a question. Please feel free to use it. Just let me know you're going to do it first. I'm going to live with chat function on this entire meeting for that reason. Why don't we just start and talk about one good thing that happened in each of our lives the past week? Brave one, go first.
I'll jump in. Thanksgiving happened, and there's a lot to be thankful for in my life. And probably the most important part of the week was getting my two college kids home for 4 days. Interestingly, they weren't in a hurry to go back to college. I thought that was kind of fun, that they actually wanted to hang out with mom and dad a little bit longer. And we actually had to encourage them to get on the road so they would make it back to the respective colleges before dark, and traffic got too bad. So just a great time with the family.
And the fried turkey worked as well as always?
We didn't do fried turkey this year. Many Many of the listeners, I'm sure, will be disappointed in that I did not go with the beer can fried turkey approach this year, but we went with a more Norman Rockwell variety of just putting it in the oven and getting it to golden brown and then carving it up, put on the vest. And I didn't wear the hat, though, to carve it up, but I did do the dad part.
That's a great family event, and I'm going to follow up. We don't have Thanksgiving here in Germany, although I was thinking of you guys. We did have first Advent weekend. This is traditionally where the family comes together, and we were making Christmas cookies, getting ready for holiday season. 4 weeks till Christmas. My parents-in-law came over. That was good for me, good for my wife, good for the kids. So that was an exciting family weekend here on the same note as Stephen.
That's great. Next.
Oh, I'll jump in next. We did our first completely remote mobile clinic today, which was great. Started off at -2 degrees, but warmed up very quickly. Actually in a scaffolding yard. So wellness advocates from a firm there. So it was an exciting day. It worked and everybody was happy. So that was our first, which was a great event before Christmas.
Say, Louise, can you describe what that looks like in maybe a minute or two so people who can't visualize have a better feel for what you're talking about?
Well, basically, it's a mobile clinic. It's got beds in it. It's got everything. It's got air conditioning. It's got fans and heating. So it literally is a bolt-on shop that can drive straight into your facility, primary care, libraries, wherever, to perform fibre scanning. You could add bloods to it. You could do various bits and pieces, but we only took the van. We only got it about a month ago, so it's actually nice to get it into use before Christmas for an assessment of staff. This firm particularly had decided it looks after its vans better than it does its staff, because of course you have to do certain things legally for a truck, but you don't have to do them legally for your staff. So they're protecting their staff, doing all of this and adding FibroScan along with a load of bloods just as a general health check.
Louise, does this van have a picture of you on the side of it?
No, but we might have to put some surfboards on the side, because you know what everybody's like when you put health on it. They think there's drugs in it and want to break in.
I like it. Jeff?
Thanks, Roger. No, I had a great and intense week, which I'm really happy I had last week, because with the lockdowns and travel restrictions coming with the new variant, I think it would have been tougher this week. We started on Monday with an event in the Spanish Parliament focused on hepatitis C elimination, with sort of the Nancy Pelosi of Spain and other Spanish leaders talking about the importance of viral hepatitis elimination. I was then in Valencia, Sitges, Santander, and then back to Barcelona after Madrid. A whirlwind tour of seeing friends, meeting new friends, and finally culminating, Stephen, with some turkey fillets fried up. And very pleased to know that the local supermarket here in Barcelona sells ready-made stuffing. I prefer to make it myself, but I didn't have time. And for a couple euros, you can just add a little water and fry that up. So I don't know who else is buying it, but I bought a couple extras.
That's awesome.
That's great, Jeff.
I think we now have the stuffing for your fried turkey at Easel.
Now, Louise, we're going to have to talk about how do you forage for mushrooms, because mushroom stuffings are really good. And with foraged mushrooms, it's amazing. It'll live up to a crunchy side of our image. So the best part of my Thanksgiving actually was on Saturday, which is, as I think I mentioned, the kids who were in Texas came back. And we had our granddaughter over to sleep over Saturday night for the first time since she's been back. 15 months makes such a difference between 2 and 3.5, or 2 1/4 and 3.5 more precisely. She's just such a different person. And it was such a fantastic time. And she promises she'll come back soon. So that'll be more fantastic times. A great note on which to end a Thanksgiving weekend and to remember what matters. With that, why don't we move on to our discussion? I sent everybody who's requested to be in live audience a copy of the article, and I think we posted a link in one of the LinkedIn's as well for those who want to read it. But I think I'm just going to ask Jeff to start off by talking a little bit about this paper and how it came to be. And I'm a big fan of Delphi processes and things like that, so also a little bit about how you actually did it, how you made the magic happen.
Thanks. I'm so incredibly excited about this paper. I mean, we had 218 co-authors from 98 different countries. I think at one point I was spending more time on making sure people's affiliations were correct than the content, at least in the proofing stage, since they managed to get off by one number. But it was a truly remarkable process and a close collaboration with the journal Nature Reviews Gastroenterology and particularly the chief editor there, Karina Ray, who was just fantastic and incredibly supportive, because she saw what we wanted to do. This emerged from the EASL International Liver Foundation with a lack, as we know, of of approved drugs, really for NAFLD and NASH, and really no public health approach being taken, at least systematically, anywhere. And co-commentators, feel free to push back. I'd love to know where there is a public health approach, particularly to fatty liver disease, but with nothing happening globally, bringing together the key stakeholders, both clinical and from the community, patient groups and patient groups of all stripes, including liver patient groups, but also obesity, diabetes. We all convened, and for over a year, we discussed that we needed to do this. We wrote some comments, we slotted it into discussions of other papers, and then finally working together with the think tank Wilton Park in the UK, we came together, we discussed the issues, and with a core group of around 40 experts from around the world, and also from the large societies, ASLD, ALE, POSL, EASL, of course, where I sit, and leading patient groups. We wrote out the statements, we worked to get agreement among us, we ran evidence reviews of where we are in different key aspects of understanding NAFLD. So, how are we doing in epidemiology, in country preparedness, prevention, treatment, awareness, education, models of care, etc. And then we put it to the group. So we asked everyone to propose experts looking for geographic and gender equity to the extent we could, so that leaders in the field from as many countries as possible, and in some countries we really tried hard to find anyone who knew anything about the liver, but some of the small island states are definitely not represented, where there was not a hepatologist in the entire nation. But really, with almost 100 countries represented, we were able to get a real understanding of the diversity of approaches, from nothing at all to a little bit, at least in terms of looking at it from the public health systems, health policy perspective. So we ran 3 Delphi rounds. So we put the statements to everyone in the first round, and then had a massive revision, and then a meeting of the steering group that Nancy Lee from the Wilton Park think tank chaired for us. We had an independent methodologist, Diana Romero from the CUNY, the City University of New York Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. So she was able to ensure that even I didn't know who was responding, and she was managing the follow-ups using the electronic system there, and someone from my team was working with her. And so it was quite a big operation. As much as I'd like to think that the different tools all work so well, we ended up having to get someone come with some coding, help us through some of the electronic and NIT issues to make sure there were no glitches and we weren't overwhelming people with follow-up messages. After that first round, the core group came together, looked at the revisions we made. Some statements completely fell out. Many were adjusted. Some were largely rewritten. We discussed it, and then we went through and discussed a set of recommendations. So we put the revised statements, the new recommendations, into round 2, into R2, back to the 218 panel members, and then we had another round of, in this case, much more minor revisions, put it to everyone again for R3, for round 3, and there we were able to get really a large degree of agreement on most of the statements. It's all reported in the article, so I won't go through it in detail, but it didn't surprise me that everyone believed in the importance of a public health approach. I was surprised sometimes how unanimous it was, with all respect to the clinicians. I appreciated that they understood how much we had to do in order to raise awareness and education. I think many people learning from viral hepatitis, where we suffered in hepatitis C, some of that diagnostic burnout, and kind of started to run out of patients in some settings, very paradoxically, with most people in the world not diagnosed. In some settings, we can't really find people to treat. So with these learnings in mind, there was a high level of agreement on most of the statements and most of the recommendations, a little bit lower on some issues around non-invasive tests, and I know you've been discussing NITs on the program earlier, but in general, we just wanted to get a baseline and say, this is where we are, which isn't very far along. That we've done some work on preparedness and found essentially of 120 countries, none scored over 50. So in the American standards, none would have passed for being prepared. I mentioned it to some colleagues in Europe, and they said 50 wasn't so bad. And I said, 50 is pretty bad if you're in school in the US. But apparently in Europe, there's some different scales in there, but no one would have passed from on a 0 to 100 score in the US. So knowing that countries are really poorly prepared, we wanted to get the key stakeholders, clinicians, patient group representatives on the same page, that we need to join together, we need to build a coalition, we need to raise awareness on a whole range of core issues, really, that were grouped into sort of 8 areas around epidemiology, awareness, care and treatment, to public health policies and leadership. In the article, we point out some really disconcerting issues, like when you look WHO, World Health Organization technical guidance on non-communicable diseases, the only time the word liver is mentioned is in the word deliver, and that's usually related to one of the other non-communicable diseases, not to mention fatty liver disease, NAFLD, NASH, not mentioned at all once in the technical materials of our leading global health, World Health body. So, we really have a long way to go, and I know we want to discuss the consensus statement more, so I won't put the cart before the horse, endorse, but the next step is really to act on this consensus statement and build that coalition so we can move forward the way folks have with other conditions.
Let's make sure we reserve time to come back to that, because I think actually you don't do the statement justice if you don't talk about the next steps. That's a really helpful start. Thank you. Jörn, how did it feel to be part of all this?
Yeah, I was very grateful Jeff invited me on, and really full credit to him and the colleagues from EASL International Liver Foundation. For me, this was one of these heads-up moments where you are rising above the area that you normally look at. I'm seeing patients discussing standard of care, test results, but all of a sudden here we are looking from a helicopter view at healthcare systems and discussing not a single patient, but the entire community. And are we prepared for this disease? The view that Jeff brought in here and all the fantastic colleagues that contribute are so much larger than the individual problems a patient has. And realizing that there's so many steps that are crucial to develop and implement care for all these many patients that are seen in everyday clinic just really was something new for me, a view that I haven't had the opportunity to partner in science with yet. So very grateful that I could become a partner in this and looking forward to develop it further, because bottom line, we can't anybody else get to be convinced that this is a serious disease. We're not going to have the funds, the research, all the requirements we need to really advance the field and for the need of our patients.
Jörn, and really, Stephen and Louise, I mean, as clinicians, I feel a little bit like here I am coming into your world, with this public health approach. And it'd be nice to hear, how do clinicians receive that? I mean, obviously, those involved in this statement, I think all received it quite well. Otherwise, they certainly weren't going to tell me. But how is it that sometimes it's a real clash between the clinical and public health approach? And in fact, if we had the kind of success I'd like to have with increased awareness, your offices would be flooded with people asking about fatty liver disease. And we know that most of them probably wouldn't need at least specialist care.
I'll take a stab at that. So, Jeff, I think this article was timely. It's very apropos and important. To your point about disease awareness, that's a huge issue. It's a huge issue for patients, for providers, for public policymakers, for the payers. It's important for all of us. You're right. If there is suddenly this outpouring of marketing and we all are aware of fatty liver, there would be a tsunami, if you will, of patients approaching the front door of these clinics that would overwhelm them. And in the U.S., we're a medical society that, quite frankly, is built on greet 'em, treat 'em, and street 'em. You've got 15 minutes to see a patient, and if you're primary care, you're going to get reimbursed based on, are you providing the level of the care that the government has established as baseline? Are you referring the patient for colon cancer screening? Are they getting their mammogram appointment? Did they get their prostate check? Is their blood pressure under control? What's their lipids look like? What's their A1C? And by the time you go through all of what we call HEDIS measures, what you're left with is about 5 minutes of, do you have a complaint today? If you have one, that's great. If you have 10, tell me the one that bothers you the most, and that's what we will address in the few minutes we have left in clinic. And we all lament the patient that comes in and they have fibromyalgia in their past medical history, because that intuitively means that they're now going to have at least 15 complaints and their medicine list is extensive. Now, that's overblown, but that's one of the things we struggle with in American healthcare, is having enough time to deal with all of the problems that these patients come in with. It doesn't make it right. We should have more time to see these patients. But even as a gastroenterologist, when I left the military and joined private practice, I was given 15-minute time slots. And as a liver doc, I said, there's no way I can see a new patient with all the complications related to liver disease in 15 minutes. So I changed mine to 30 minutes, but that was met with a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth. The one thing that when I read through the consensus statement that I wish we had more data on so that we could be a little bit more insightful to providers was, what is the true prevalence of NASH and what is the true prevalence of NASH with fibrosis that we call the at-risk NASH patient? Because we talk a lot about the overall global prevalence of fatty liver, 20-25%, depending on what continent you're on. It could be as high as 33% or as low as 15%. And all that's variable depending on what you use to screen them with. Was it ALT? Was it ultrasound? Was it whatever? We all realize that the majority of these patients aren't going to progress to a liver-related outcome. They're certainly at risk for lots of things, diabetes, heart disease, whatever. But from a liver perspective, if that's what we're focused on as hepatologists, at least in my lane, what is that true number that I need to be out there communicating to primary care? What is that number? That's still up in the air a bit. And if we had more knowledge around that, it would allow us to be more laser focused in our message that we want to deliver to primary care and our referring providers and our patients.
Stephen summarized this very nicely. If we get an agreement on a public health agenda and we have implemented models of care, we would get patients referred that we need to see, that do need expert care, with the tests potentially in place for us to see them in 10 minutes and decide this is advanced fibrosis. I do get an additional test X, and then I prescribe the medicine. So I think these type of models, looking from the scientific aspect, are really the basis for us to move forward. Now, how to implement that at your local care setting, I think this is another story that requires more thinking. Laying out the path, this is a very crucial document.
Thanks, Jörn, and thanks, Stephen. So, Stephen, I appreciate that. And I think it's going to be quite some time before we have strong data at the global level. I even remember in HIV and AIDS as a student, when we were quite far along with UNAIDS estimates, suddenly they were reduced by 6 million due to methodological issues, primarily in India. And then again, with hepatitis C, much of that reduction from 2016 to 2019 is related to stronger methodologies. It's going to be a while before we really know the numbers. But what I'm hearing is we need to get better at risk stratification. Even if we don't know those with NASH or those with advanced fibrosis, we do know that there's a lot of people who have fatty liver disease, and there's a lot of good reasons to address that, including all of the metabolic comorbidities. And Jörn, led an important study with the costing. One of the main reasons I want to know how many people are out there is because I want to look at what the cost of inaction is to get policymakers to move on it. The real numbers, I think we're going to be surprised. I think they're going to be very different than what we've been estimating, but it's really anybody's guess. And like you said, the difference between, is it 20% of the adult population and 25% is gigantic, and yet those are the numbers we throw around. But I always tell people if it was 5 or 10% of the adult population, that would just still be extraordinary. And it means there's so much we need to do to address fatty liver disease, even if we don't even know how many of them are going to have advanced fibrosis.
Just to follow up on that, we were reviewing data today from a very important study being conducted predominantly in the U.S. in a phase 2B setting with the therapy for NASH. And as we all know, the screen fail rates for these studies are inextricably high, on the order of 70, 80, 85%. And so we all struggle with how do we identify the right patient to put into screening. And so we were mining the screen fail data, and this is something that is near and dear to Jörn's heart as well. And one of the things that comes up over and over and over again when we mine the data is older post-menopausal females with diabetes that isn't well controlled, not out of control diabetes, but not HbA1c's below 6 either. So we're talking about diabetes with fasting plasma glucoses above 125-ish range in an older population of typically post-menopausal females. If you look at who gets bad NASH, if you enroll trials with F3 and F4 disease, it's overwhelmingly female. So if we were to target the low-hanging fruit that we all talk about, that's a message that could be delivered today. It's been shown in multiple different data sets that population of patients over and over again is at significantly increased risk. So even if we don't have full data on a population level, we do have enough data, I think, to where we can begin to send a message of, look, we may not know all the answers, but we know some of the answers, and let's at least get that out there.
Louise, go ahead.
I read the consensus statement with interest because there are lots of strengths around the world in various healthcare areas. And for me, it's about looking to take the strengths from one area and combine it with the strengths of the other. We have lots of weaknesses as well. We have a lot of siloed health system, which is a considerable weakness and obstruction to the care of the individual. But it means we, throughout those areas where that is the predominant use, we don't utilise dietary resources. We don't utilise and share the resources that we could be doing. One of the best sets that I've seen, and I'm not familiar with the way it's configured in the States, but when I go to Perth, on the block, every healthcare provider will be in one block. So you'll have your radiology next, your pharmacy next to somewhere else, next to your podiatrist next to. So what they do is try and fix them into one small area. So if you're going to travel for healthcare or wellness, you travel to one little area and get it all done at that time. We're looking at a similar model here in the UK for diagnostic hubs so that that people go to a central area rather than just split throughout the healthcare systems. But there's lots of strengths throughout, and I thought the consensus piece was really good at looking at some of the weaknesses, but also identifying where there were some strengths. In education, looking at patient involvement, which is becoming more stronger and stronger throughout the field. It was great to see so many countries involved, and it would be great to sort of break the glass ceiling, to have it acknowledged as an NCD. So I was greatly encouraged by what was said throughout, and I bang on education, education, education. But just picking up on Jeff's comment about cost, for every person that we take off the pathway with early notification of liver fat, that's potentially a diabetes case avoided. The cost saving potentially of this sort of consensus and implementation throughout the world, particularly in low and socioeconomic countries, I just can't fathom those numbers, let alone promoting wellness.
Jeff, you want to comment on that?
Thank you very much. It's funny to hear we want this non-communicable disease to be recognized as a non-communicable disease because it's a non-communicable disease. But I also worked for 11 years at WHO and a lot of that time on hepatitis C, and I was alone. We didn't have any department back then that dealt with viral hepatitis. Hepatitis B was under vaccine preventable infections, and we had no strategy. This is how we start. We're friends with WHO. WHO director was at our Wilton Park meeting and engaged in the discussions, but there's a lot of advocacy among our own health experts actually to get this recognized and the seriousness of this recognized. And I'm sure Stephen, Jörn, Louise, you could comment even on your own colleagues in the clinical settings. People don't take fatty liver disease always so seriously when most people who die of NASH will die of cardiovascular disease. There's so many comorbidities. There's no drugs for it. So it's kind of like, why are you bothering us?
So Jeff, before we go back to these folks, you touched on in one statement what I thought were two of the really interesting things in this document. First of all, the difference between, I think, this non-communicable diseases is that people don't recognize that this is a disease. You never get to the non-communicable part because doctors say to patients all the time, you have fatty liver, but don't worry about it. Lots of people have it. Nothing you can do about it. It's not a big problem. So they treat it as not a disease, and simply elevating the salience of the disease will help tremendously. And then the second thing goes back to your comment, and also something Stephen said earlier, and the, I think, inherent tension between them, which is that NASH progresses to cirrhosis is a liver disease with a relatively short-term serious consequence. NASH back at F2 is a part of a metabolic syndrome where, as Louise points out, you affect diabetes. As you point out, you affect cardiovascular death. It really morphs from one set of problems into another. I would think that one of the opportunities is for people to recognize what a unique problem that causes, but also how it can hit two pins with one ball.
I always look at it as if you're going to build a new house, you need to look at the foundations when you bring it down. When I look at fatty liver disease, it's within the foundations of all of the other diseases. There's a concern that we're plateauing. We're treating cardiovascular disease better, so we're saving more lives, but we're plateaued, and the incidences around the world are increasing. The same with type 2 diabetes. But if you don't look at the foundation or the elephant in the room or whatever you want to call it and address one of the fundamental areas by ignoring it, you're never going to get it to where it should be in these disease areas. So maybe it's just me. If you just ignore 1/3 of your causality because it's stigmatized so much, people just don't see it, as we've said. Primary care don't see it as a cause or a concern. We're driving it even though we're interested in the F3, F4 level. Somebody's got to drive it, and I can't think of anybody better than Jeff and Donna and everybody else.
Well, it takes a village, and having so many co-authors and having so many hepatologists and respected leaders in the field buy into this. I didn't know how people would react to a public health approach and even how the journals would react. This was the first time Nature Reviews Gastrohep ever did a Delphi study, and they were very excited and very engaged. It was so interesting that at the end, Chief Editor Katrina Ray asked, because one thing was 218 co-authors, another was more than 100 organizations within 2 weeks and just before publication were shown the document and agreed to endorse it. The chief editor of Nature Reviews Gastrohep said, could other Nature journals endorse this? And suddenly the other Nature journals dealing with our comorbidities said, hey, fatty liver disease is important to us. We're going to endorse this statement. And Nature itself came and endorsed. It became like just sort of this family came together, and even within journals that are often working in a very parallel manner, they came around this article. And it was really a neat process. Obviously I've never experienced that in one of my articles before where you send send it off, you get the reviews, you get the proofs, you have 48 hours, and off it goes. It became really kind of an event, and in that sense was very exciting.
Great. And the other aspect I think is very important. We need awareness in terms of those journals in the scientific community, because in the end, you also need independent funding. So you need funders to give money to researchers, and that money should not necessarily always come from pharma companies, but you need an independent research platform here to really engage academia and develop pharma independent aspects. So I think at multiple levels, this is so useful for the field. Endorsement by these major scientific journals will really support this.
That makes tremendous sense. Jeff, you wanted to make sure that we had time to get to what comes next. So unless Stephen or Louise has another comment or Jörn about the statement itself, why don't we dive into what comes next?
Well, yeah, what comes next? You'll have to also tell me what you want next. I mean, what I'd like to see is the coalition that we put forward, the collaboration that we have, continue. So we'll be having a discussion at Wilton Park. Everyone's invited. It's obviously virtual now. Next week to talk about how to move the agenda forward. And going into 2022, we'll be talking about how, again, from this public health perspective, we can build a truly global coalition. Everyone is fully inclusive. There's no ownership. It's very transparent. It's something more along the lines of the World Hepatitis Alliance than it is let's say, or the Eurotest initiative than it would be a single organization leading it, because we all have the common goal, but someone needs to grab the bull by the horns and start making this happen. We're going to have a paper out soon, a much smaller Delphi process. Might not qualify to make it onto Surfing NASH, but basically what we do is we put NAFLD into the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we show how, when you have targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, like having green spaces nearby or having a safe place to walk near your home, that actually is a way of starting to measure if we're going to be able to properly address fatty liver disease. To understand that if our urban spaces aren't fit for purpose and people can't walk, bike, and otherwise exercise, we're going to have problems due to the sedentary lifestyle, the diet and exercise issues we're facing. So we have that coming out as we try and elevate this into the SDGs, but I think we're going to also need to be working at the national level. That's how big change came about with hepatitis. There was no strategy until certain patient groups discussed with certain governments about getting this onto the World Health Assembly agenda, onto the Standing Committee of the Executive Board of the World Health Assembly. So we're going to need to be very strategic. We're going to need to discuss with our colleagues about how to do that kind of advocacy, how we can build on the models of care that we discussed in the last program and that we revisit in the consensus statement, because those models of care are multidisciplinary. So again, I don't think the liver field is going to have success going it alone. And while we can recruit diabetes and obesity, maybe even cardiology to the cause, I think we're going to also have to think a lot bigger about what a statement it is on our society when our livers start failing. I'll just end on the note that this week EASL and the Lancet will launch a commission that looks specifically at that issue. 3-year commission looking at sort of the liver as a window onto, in this case, European society, and how we're so focused on dealing with end-stage liver disease and not on prevention. And part of that prevention is making sure our environment is much more improved so we're able to address the underlying factors that lead to fatty liver disease in the first place.
Yeah, Jeff, you talked about a window. I used the phrase the canary in the coal mine. That's essentially what the liver is for metabolic sensing for our body. And that's a phrase I like to use with my patients. The younger ones have no idea what that means. I have to explain that. The older ones tend to get it, particularly when you bring up the word coal mine. They're like, what? We don't do that really, do we? That's all, the green part coming out. But just to your comment, I like to look at this as two pillars that need work, and they have to be done in parallel. You mentioned spaces and places for people to go and exercise. I get it, that we need that. That can't happen unless the phrase I use here is heart transformation leads to behavioral modification. If you don't change the heart and the mind, they're not going to go and do the things they need to do to make those inherent dramatic changes in their lifestyle. Think about it. The average age of a NASH patient is mid-50s, early 50s, mid-50s, my age, 52. And as a retired colonel in the Army, I tell my patients, look, I let you do it your way for 52 years. And this is where we wound up. You have NASH with stage 3, stage 4 disease. Obviously, that didn't go well. So now I need you to do it the colonel's way. I need you to understand that if you don't have a dramatic change, 180-degree pivot in the way you're conducting your life, not only will you develop diabetes, but you may die of heart disease sooner, sooner. You may die of an extrahepatic malignancy sooner. You may progress to cirrhosis and decompensate. And you need to understand, yes, I am trying to scare you. I am trying to do everything I can in my power to convince you to turn the ship around and go sail in the opposite direction. You need to understand that you can't just dabble around the edges. You have to be all in. This is my analogy of the chicken and the pig at breakfast. You know, the chicken just contributes an egg every morning and is involved. But the pig, he's all in. All in. Ham, bacon, one time he gave it everything. And that's what you have to be. And that's the message we have to convey to our patients. And where does that start? Does that start at the primary care level? Does it start with publications like what you and Jörn and others have put out? It really begins there. We have to deliver a succinct message, and maybe not the same message to patients as it is to primary care, but we need to deliver a message that is impactful, and that at the same time, then we have a message to our governmental agencies that say we have to create spaces and places for people to go and do those things. But quite frankly, that's going to be at the groundswell level as well. If you've got people beating down the door of their local government saying, I don't have anywhere to go work out. My doctor told me I had to, or I'm going to wind up on a liver transplant list somewhere, then that gets the attention of the people that run our country.
That was incredibly well put, and the canary in the coal mine definitely resonates. And it's a sad state of affairs that we even need to get that far. But when people are diagnosed, there was this debate some years ago in Eastern Europe. Do you encourage people to get diagnosed for HIV in the absence of antiretroviral therapy? And I remember being so surprised that so many people were saying no. And I said, well, I think there's a moral obligation for them to know. And I also think you're building up the group of supporters to do something about it. And I feel the same way about fatty liver disease. I don't want to flood your offices, but I think people need to know that there's one more really important reason for them to start to change their individual behavior. We also know that individual behavior change alone is tough to maintain. So we're going to have to look at, well, what can we change structurally? And that goes into issues like the built environment and even what's in our food. We're going to have to attack this from different perspectives.
People don't hear about fatty liver disease until they're diagnosed with it, sadly. We do have to increase the education around that, the wellness aspect, just people's general awareness. We've had recent publications here about the world's biggest disease that nobody's ever heard of in the national press. There is some traction. It's not necessarily exercise, it's increasing movement. Now, that movement could be in your sofa, it could be in the chair. It's not necessarily your thumbs on a Game Boy, but that's how out I am. But I think there are ways when you speak to individuals that you can put something in. That's really encouraging for those individuals, because otherwise they feel that there's nothing they can do. There's no change. They don't have the equipment. I have a conversation with one of my previous consultants. We must get the heart rate above 135 to fat burn. We've got to start walking first. So it's about realistic. And I think where healthcare has lots of basic strengths is we have all of the equipment, we have all of the specialists. They're not necessarily all in the right order and all in the right place. If you play a tune in all the different notes, you may have all of the notes, but in the wrong order. So what we need to be a little bit more savvy with is coordinating that. Jeff is absolutely right. This has to be linked to the SDGs. If you look at Al Capone, they got him on tax evasion, not anything else. Go for something where it makes a difference. We cannot do the whole lot, but the one SDG that we are never going to hit is the rise of liver cancer. Cancer is not going to hit its SDG because liver cancer has exploded around the world. So that's probably the one weak point the WHO have. Unless the liver community and they target the liver, we are not going to get anywhere near that one SDG. So that's the Achilles heel for the SDGs as far as I can see them where liver is. So go for the weak spot. Let's get them engaged in that. We've got Australia cascading up with liver cancer. It's now making the national press. So there are ways we can coordinate it. All of these governments, and I've said it before, they're all signed up to SDGs. I would love to see a non-communicable disease coordination in each healthcare area so that they can take the strengths of diet, exercise, and we can use it for everything that's got a common link rather than just siloed budgets and siloed health, splitting it. So it becomes more integrated. You combine our strengths So we talk about the Mediterranean diet, but there's got to be an equivalent diet in each cultural norm and something that people can see within their own area. So there's lots of strengths we have. We just need to play all of the notes in the right order, I suppose.
I fully agree. And Louise, in addition to the SDGs, you mentioned cancer. In Europe, we have the Beat Back Cancer Plan. The European Commission and the Health Commissioners take cancer very seriously. And we know from the JAMA Oncology GBD paper a few years ago that liver cancer is the second leading cause of disability-adjusted life years. And we know, not just because we have less hepatitis C, but we know that fatty liver disease is now becoming the major contributor to liver cancer. So again, we need to talk about cancer prevention when we're talking about fatty liver disease. I feel like we have to get fatty liver disease into everybody else's agenda. If that's how it is, that's fine with me, whatever works. Whether it's the SDGs, the cancer plan, maybe a reach with cardiology, but certainly with obesity, diabetes, and at some point we really have to get primary care understanding that when they're already working to motivate their clients, their patients to lose weight and exercise more, fatty liver disease can contribute to the argument. I don't think it will be the reason that they take on that issue. It's sort of one more tool in the arsenal.
So, Jeff, thanks. Stephen, I know you have to leave in a couple of minutes. I have a thought, but before I do that, let me give you a chance to close out. My closing question today was going to be, for each of us, the one inflection point that you think has to get hit the hardest and can get hit the hardest, two different issues, in terms of increasing salience, awareness, and action against NAFLD. Place to hit hardest and places you can hit hardest.
It's one point, but it has to be in two parts. Number one is we have to deliver a clear message, and it can't be convoluted by saying fatty liver is important here, but it's not important here. The prevalence is higher over here. I think what we need to do is say, look, give me something simple. Give our doctors on the front line, our providers on the front line, something real simple to go after. We're probably, very realistically, we're under 2 years to our first FDA-approved treatment for NASH. It's coming. We're getting really good at our non-invasive tests. We will be beyond the biopsy, I think, sooner than most people realize. So what does that right patient population look like that I need to go after to target and have a conversation to say, look, if you don't shape up, bad things are going to happen to you. If you go and talk to primary care and say, we just need to focus on fatty liver patients, then what you get from an endocrinologist, for instance, is I've never seen a fatty liver patient progress to cirrhosis. That's because by the time they're cirrhotic, they're seeing a transplant surgeon and they never come back to the endocrinologist. We have to deliver a very simple, pragmatic message, and we can build around that nucleus of a message in concentric rings as we get better therapies and better diagnostic tests. I said this in our postgrad course talk at AASLD. We're at the right plane level of diagnostics and the right plane level of public awareness. We're not at the 5th generation strike fighter. We don't have a way to measure the disease effectively, diagnose the disease effectively and efficiently. We don't have treatment for the disease. It's very targeted, precision medicine, laser focused. It doesn't mean we can't begin to deliver the right message for public health. So I think it's two-pronged. Let's get real simple with our message and let's put a massive multimedia campaign together to get there. Publications, presentations, working with our patient advocacy groups, working on Capitol Hill, et cetera.
Thanks, Stephen. And if you got to jump.
I do have to jump, but let me say, Jeff, thank you so much for coming back on. Thank you for all your work that you're doing in this field. I know you're involved in many different areas, and we're thankful for your time that you give us in hepatology. And Jörn, thank you for your time, and Louise as well for staying up late and being on with us again. Roger, I appreciate it, and I'll leave it to you guys.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, so Jeff, just to up the burden, I've already got a plan for the third episode, the smallest Delphi you talked about, which we'll go over later. About when you come back with that one, what do we want to make of it? We've had two conversations on this podcast in the last couple of months that bear on this issue in two very different ways. First of all, Ken Kuzi came on, I guess, about 2 months ago, really, to talk about the clinical care pathways paper that was published in Gastroenterology that was the work of multiple specialties, coordinated, I guess, under the aegis of the AGA, that he was the lead author on. I think, Jeff, that touches on a lot of the points, at least in the state, not that it's gone anywhere yet, but the kind of model that you can build in this system that makes sense. It was a pathway. It had steps. It was, this is what you do, and then this is what you do, and then this is what you do, and the reason everybody should care. So foundationally, on the medical side, I thought that was really interesting. As I was listening to you today, I was realizing that those two might interlink in some ways. That what you're talking about making happen, that's an effort to begin to make happen, at least in the States. That was number one. Number two is Scott Freeman was on during ASLD, and he characterized NAFLD as an environmental disease. His point being, eating, we've had, people have been around for tens of thousands of years. Our genes don't change very quickly. And yet in the last 35 years, this disease has taken us by storm. And what's changed in the last 35 years are eating habits. And eating habits affect on the microbiome. And as we learn more about how the microbiome interacts with neuronal systems and other things in the body, that's a pathway that merits a lot more attention than it's getting right now. Louise made an offhanded comment to me on a side note last week about we have to think about this as an environmental issue also. Now, I don't think that was exactly the same thing, but the points I think are related. There are policy issues around how we think about food and our ecosystem in terms of what people eat that clearly come into play when you think about this disease. Just thoughts about either of those?
So that's one of the things that actually gives me hope, even though it's a big challenge to address the entire environment and what we're eating at the same time. But I mean, it does mean that we have allies in groups that are trying to protect our climate, in groups that are trying to work for healthy eating, because that's how we're going to really change things in a big way. It's going to end up being a bigger difference than the individual behavior change, although I think that's also important. And, in the work that Ken Kuzi led and that pathway, it's remarkable and it's tangible, and that's what we're going to need more of. A lot of that's going to come at the national level too, because our health systems in Europe are so different and it's so heterogeneous. We're going to need to understand what needs to be done at the primary care level. How do we engage with endo? How do we engage with other comorbidities and other colleagues, and who's going to be paying for it? What you suggest about in our allies, it's like what Louise was saying with the SDGs. I mean, we need to think big. I mean, this is a big change. Stephen's absolutely right. This is the canary in the coal mine. You said one big change we've had has been our eating habits. The other big change, of course, is sedentary lifestyle, which has gotten a lot worse during the pandemic. And then the other big change is much more positive, which is that we're living longer. The good thing about the liver is it takes a long time before it conks out, but we're also living a really long time now. As WHO said, mortality is 100%. We're all going to die of something. The question is just what. We could get a lot more time if we address liver health, and now we're seeing what's going to happen. When Stephen was talking about the importance of data, it made me think of the modeling that the Center for Disease Analysis, Chris Estes, Homi Razavi, and others, and partners in countries have been carrying out. Because when they look at what's going to happen in terms of F4 cases in 2030 due to fatty liver disease, you get a doubling, tripling, or quadrupling in the countries that they analyzed. I realize modeling is a very powerful tool, and we need to do more of it. I realize it's modeling, and it's based on a lot of assumptions, but the future looks quite bleak if we don't do anything. And that's the kind of messaging we're going to need to get to policymakers, combined with the kind of costing, for the work that Jörn was leading, so they can see the cost of inaction.
That's what struck me in the piece, was that doubling and tripling of compensated and decompensated cirrhosis, because that's immediate. That's in the next few years. And our hospitals are certainly not configured for that level of patient illness coming through. So unless we, as policymakers, unless health purchasers really start to look at these figures, cirrhosis is increasing over 10 to 15% per year in each hospital. So we just don't have the resources to look after and care for these people appropriately. And that should never be a state of lack of knowledge, to be able to offer somebody the best care available in your local trust or local hospital. And that's where the immediate liver risk is, for me, is the quality of care and outcomes that these patients are going to get in the next 15 to 20 years, unless we actually start to change it now and wake up.
Thanks, Louise. Let me just interject quickly before we go on to a couple more comments. I want to give our audience a gift. The gift is called the Law of 72. It's a very simple statistical rule that you can use in situations like this, which is you take a number, you divide 72 by that number, and that will tell you how fast the incidence of whatever you're looking at will double. So let's say that the cirrhosis number is 12%, for example. Law of 72 says you take 72, you divide it by 12, and you get 6, and that says doubling in 6 years, which says quadrupling in 12 years. So if you want to understand roughly what happens if nothing changes, it's my gift to everyone who listens to this podcast. Use it wisely, use it often, and when appropriate, scare the stuffing out of people with it. Like, say, that example. Jeff, Jörn, go on. Comments, thoughts?
That's the point, is that look at how quickly things are going to get so bad. I mean, it sneaks up on you. I mean, in cirrhosis, well, it sneaks up in years, not months or weeks like the current COVID pandemic, but suddenly before we know it, liver cancer was the second leading cause of DALYs of all cancers, and people seemed really surprised. Everyone in hepatology knew it was coming. We might not have known the exact numbers, but we were thinking, well, it's going to be number one day. And like I said, with the modeling study, by 2030, things are looking pretty bad, and we're about to end 2021. And that was really, to go back full circle, that was the impetus of the consensus statement, was to take that public health approach and say, in the face of this major challenge, there's a lot we can do. And there's a lot of allies and potential allies out there. But right now, we're almost at ground zero. And in 2022, we really need to turn that around. And we need to work to not just get it into WHO documents, to get it into one of the WHO official days, the way we did with hepatitis and HIV and malaria and TB. We need that attention. We need the World Health Assembly. So whatever one thinks about WHO and its assembly, in the end, it's governed by its member states. And we need those member states to recognize at an assembly meeting in May each year that fatty liver disease is serious. And even if they call for a strategy or an approach or a framework some years down the line, that they at least acknowledge now that we are going to need it.
Thanks, Jeff. Jörn, you have a comment, or we'll go to final question?
Yeah, I guess my comment is that really, and this is where the expertise of Jeff and the public health care research field comes in, that we get policy makers to consider this as a disease that needs a strategy and an outlook. I've mentioned funding independently for universities, but you've got to come up with a plan for your healthcare system. There are disease management plans in Germany, and I'm waiting for the day that we have the term liver in there in an obesity package or an obesity care path. We got to, at that political level, grow this together, and that's far beyond what I could achieve as a physician, and this is where the public health agenda experts come in. I think that's why I'm so happy we're at this point.
Well, okay, Jörn, thanks for that, and I think that's a great comment on which to go to final comments. I already gave you the question, right? One place where you think we need to have the greatest impact, and one place where we can have meaningful impact quickly in this entire panoply of issues discussed in the consensus paper and everything else we talked about today. Stephen went first, so brave one goes second.
In Germany, you're settling up with a new government here, and healthcare officials are being formed and panels are being formed. So I'd really like to reach out and be in touch with them based on this type of work and contribute to these policies that will be making up the next 4 years of German healthcare. And of course, even longer, because the problem's real. It's there. It's the money. It's costly. By looking at it from a public health agenda, we can define the need here.
I'm going to jump in next to give Jeff the last word. Not dissimilar to yours. Here we're looking at more integrated care pathways. We're looking at diagnostic hubs being set centrally, and FibroScan and non-invasive technologies were advocated in there. But they'll only get there if commissioners understand that the liver is actually an important cost to them and to the patients within their region. I'm happy to go and scan every commissioner in the country to show you what your liver health is like, if it takes you to understand your own liver health. But we really need to have liver higher on the agenda in the commissioning hubs and for who's purchasing healthcare to get out there to have a look at liver health, because everybody I know now knows somebody who's got liver cancer, and that can't continue.
Sadly, it probably will. I will let Jeff have the last word, which means I'll go next. This is a terribly male and terribly pugilistic view of the world. But one way to think of this particular enemy is if what you were talking about is boxing. And the left jab is the non-communicable disease and what it does to the overall metabolic system, diabetes, heart, etc. And then the uppercut is actually liver cancer. So if the jab hasn't taken you out, the liver cancer will cause a demon of a problem for you. It's hard for people to get two thoughts into their mind at once, but here I think it's pivotal. So I'm guessing smarter people with me who've got much better visualization powers will come up with a better way to characterize that. But that really is the point. It's both the jab and the uppercut. And I think if we understand the role that both of them play in the scale of this issue, it'll be easier to get people doing the things they've got to do. And with Jeff, my friend, last word's yours.
Thank you so much, Roger, and thanks, Louise and Jörn, for this discussion that's been so important and enlightening. I like the boxing analogy. I would say the inflection point for me is that we're going to need to see modeling beyond 4 or 5 or even 10 countries so that we can see just how bad this is going to get, and again, how much it's going to cost to really get policymakers to react. We've seen how slow they react on so many issues. But now, like you said, Louise, so many people have liver cancer. We need to find allies, unfortunately, among those important people who, and spokespeople who have had liver cancer or have had someone close affected to them. That the patient groups are incredibly important, but they are quite weak in most countries. So we're going to need to strengthen our ground. We're going to need our foot soldiers, the patient advocates, the patient groups. It's going to take you hepatologists and other liver health experts to work with them and to build that army to raise awareness about how serious serious a condition is. And like you said, Roger, it's going to be a left jab, it's going to be a right uppercut, but one way or another, the liver is going to get a lot of people, and it's going to get a lot of people by surprise. And with the numbers we have projected to 2030, it's going to be a major public health problem, not just because we said it is in 2021, it simply will be.
I have one more question for you. This is a U.S. question. Everybody who listens to this podcast regularly has been beat to death appropriately with the data from the two San Antonio Medical Military Center studies that Stephen did in 2011 and 2021 that suggested among a group of walking around people in their 50s in San Antonio who thought they had no cause for pain or concern about their livers, that 37% had NAFLD, 14% had NASH, and in the latest round, 6% had F2 or greater, which is the one number that had changed over the 10 years. It was 2%, now that's 5.9%. I shared those numbers with the public policy friends who said you can never let those numbers get out. And I asked why, and the answer was because even at 20 to 25, the numbers we're using right now, people who have to pay for this are scared to death. And if you give the numbers that are any higher, the odds that they're just going to stick their heads in the sand and deny the problem becomes infinitely greater, particularly private sector payers in the U.S. I'm wondering whether there is a risk that if we amplify the problem to its true scale, we start to scare people away or get them to throw up their hands. And how do you see dealing with that?
I think that's a really good point. And I do think that that is a real problem. I mean, if we cry pack of wolves and there's only a wolf, people aren't going to listen as carefully. I think we need to be very careful not to overestimate the numbers. That was a big problem with HIV. It's a problem with hepatitis C, and it's a lingering problem because it looks like things got a lot better when they actually didn't get a lot better, at least in terms of mortality. They got a lot better in new models of care, more people aware of the treatment and better prescribing and so on. So I do think it's an issue. The numbers are high enough now to worry people. We need to appeal also to, on the one side, the economics. For those in the US, that's a real issue, the cost of inaction. And in Europe, there are value systems we need to appeal to in addition to the economic arguments. But we need to avoid exaggerating the issue. We need to talk to our allies and say that this is going to make the diabetes worse. This is going to cause more CVD. That we know. And we don't need to exaggerate the numbers of people with fatty liver disease, but we know that there will be serious issues with the comorbidities in addition to the own mortality through liver cancer and end-stage liver disease. Okay,
so we'll let that be the last word. That's great. So Jeff, first of all, thank you for joining us. This is an amazingly important paper. I think it's the articulation of a turning point. It really is kind of the slap in the face of the whole world that says, hey, folks, pay attention starting now. And exquisitely executed and really fantastic thing, and I'm excited to see what comes next. Thank you for joining us at what is now getting just past 10:30 in the evening your time. One more definition of commitment, although it is likewise for Jörn and 9:30 for Louise. Thanks all of you for taking part of this. And Jeff, I welcome you back when we've got the shorter Delphi. As I said, I'll chat with you a little bit later, maybe this week or next week, about what I've got in mind. And Jörn, Louise, thanks so much for your time. Everyone in the audience, I'll be back in a minute with the business section. Until then, we'll see you next week. Stay safe, surf on. To our panelists, thanks guys. Bye-bye now.
Welcome to today's episode 59 business section.
Hi, listeners and downloaders. Well, that was a remarkable session. The idea of a global Delphi study with 218 leaders and a steering committee of 33 or so people debating key points, the scale is massive. I love this effort. I love what Jeff does. At Surfing NASH, we will do whatever we can to support him and the group's work.
So, Roger, what are you doing tomorrow?
Answer. I'll be on GLI Live with Donna Cryer. That airs at noon Wednesday, so when you hear this, that will have happened already. My first time ever as a podcast guest. That's kind of cool. You can catch replays on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, I think.
One takeaway from today. Come join us live.
This was the first episode of the last 3 without a live participant, and I have to tell you, it felt different. I've enjoyed having audience members join us to engage, others to send me questions to share, and still others to tell me about what looks right and sounds right in the audience. We're working out the rough spots on getting invitations out on a timely basis, but the system is improving. Thanksgiving last week didn't help any. And I want to offer my personal thanks to the 4 people who added themselves to the Surfing Live list in just the last 3 hours. And there were more in the morning. So listen, Riverside FM says they can handle a live audience of up to 1,000 people. Let's test them.
So it's December. What's coming the rest of this month?
Simple answer, some great stuff. Next week, we'll preview NASH Tag with Stephen, Jörn, and one other guest surfer to be named. On December 15th, our last group session of the year will have lead author Ali Amirian from the Cleveland Clinic and co-author Naeem Al-Khoury join the regulars to discuss the groundbreaking Splendor study, which I talked about already in advance on the podcast. A majorly important study, very exciting stuff. You'll want to hear it. Year-end, I'm working on some individual programming and some exciting themes. Keep your eyes and ears open for more information. We'll be interviewing some of this year's surfers and doing a few 2 other things.
Once again, tell Roger what you would like to see in Season 3.
I asked this question 2 weeks ago, but I haven't seen much response. Now, I know we have plenty of room for improvement, and that many people just like change. So please send us your suggestions, whether we need to improve or whether you just want different. I want to know what you want to see.
This week, the buzz and vault is mostly about recent events.
Okay, first the buzz. This week marks our largest week ever in terms of 28-day downloads. When we hit that target a couple of weeks ago, I thought we wouldn't surpass it for a while. We are. And in fact, we will have about as many downloads in November as we have in October, and October was 50% higher than any month before that. So we are so delighted that so many of you keep showing up, listening, downloading. In terms of pod status countries, we've been sitting at 10 or 12 all week, including making the list in Spain this week for, I believe, the first time in the podcast history. The Vault report starts with the Paris NASH imaging conversation 46.2 again, because it garnered another 80 new downloads again last week, now to sit at 661 as of 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday. Keep in mind, the second most listened is 313. Interesting, another conversation, episode 57.1 from the AASLD wrap-up, is outpacing the total episode. The second time that's happened, 46.2 was the first. This tells me people are hearing something special in that conversation. If you missed episode 57, or even if you didn't, you might want to check 57.1 out to see what you think. Despite a heavy download week, nothing in year 1 or early year 2 stood out, but some episodes from the last few months did really well. Episode 41 with Ken Kusi about multidisciplinary NAFLD care models continues to grow nicely. Episode 42 about FGF with Arun Sanyal. Episode 43 with Jörn Schattenberg about cirrhosis. And Ken Kusi's more recent episode 49 about the critical care pathway are all doing extremely well 2 to 3 months after rollout. The recent episodes, Lars Johansson on Exit 50, Scott Freeman on 51, Lena Allen on 52, those are doing well as well. And Exit 55, the Day 3 AASLD episode, is the fastest grower we've had since the FDA webcast back in January, and the second fastest grower ever. If you missed that, you might want to hear it, even if you heard the day. People seem to like it. So with that, I want to thank today's superb panelists, and once more express my exceptional respect for Jeff Lazarus and the work that he does. Not that everyone else's work isn't great, but I find some of his stuff amazing. I want to thank our engineer, Mike Wilson, who for the third week in a row has had to save some staticky recordings because of line noise. I want to thank Eric Rounds, who's been driving social media daily as things get busier, and Steve Bannon, who helps this entire thing make sense structurally, and who's driving the broadening of the podcast series that we're going to be working on and telling you more about in the months ahead. Finally, it all starts with you, our listeners, who provide energy and inspiration for us to do this every week. So we'll be back next week with an hashtag preview. Until then, stay safe, surf on. See you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.